This is a flipped classroom presentation of a lecture about natural selection. With your study guide handy, I want you to notice that this lecture is going to correlate with NGSS standards 4-2 and 4-3. The note packet that you should have in front of you also has those standards listed in the margin. So please make sure that you are always correlating back to the standards as to what you need to have. 4 principles of evolution. They have printed on your page already for you, but we're going to annotate those a little bit. First thing, variations of traits exist in any population. When we were doing our P's and our Q's and our Hardy-Weinberg equations, we were talking about variations of traits. Fur color with our bunny beans. We had 2 variations of fur color. The fur color was the trait. Variations would be the dark fur versus the light fur. Traits are passed from parent to offspring. You know that. If you look at your parents and yourself, you can see that you got some of those characteristics from mom versus some of those characteristics from dad. Same goes for any sexually reproduced organism, whether it be plants or animals. In nature, most of the time, organisms are going to produce more offspring than actually survive. So think about animals that have huge litters of offspring. Why do they do that? Because it's going to increase the chances that more will survive. Here's the rub though. The more offspring that you have, you actually end up having more competition for those resources. So it's not always a good thing. So then of the group of organisms that were born, if you're competing for the same resource, food or shelter or water, which ones are going to probably survive better? The ones who are stronger to begin with. And so out of that, we've got the ability to grow up and reproduce is going to be dependent on those characteristics that you have. Are they favored in the environment in which you are living? Characteristics that are favored, we are going to call adaptations. It is this word right here that makes me crazy. Because if you were to look at the dictionary's definition of adaptation and biology's definition of adaptation, the dictionary's definition is misleading. When you think of the English definition of adapt, you think you are going to change or modify in response to a situation. But that's not how evolution works. That's not how adaptations work. You are born with those characteristics. Any living thing starts their life with those characteristics. You can't change them. We did a lab with the bird beak. Some of you tried turning the spoon around. No, you cannot change the characteristic that you were born with. And so it's either, if they are an adaptation, those are characteristics that are favored. Those adaptations are going to increase the biological fitness of the organism. You know fitness. You've heard fitness in your PE classes. Fitness is going to be strong health, right? Strong bodies. Biological fitness is the ability to grow up and reproduce. So fitness is the ability to grow up, if you will, and reproduce. I'm afraid that's going to fall off my page. So the ability to grow up and reproduce. If your biological fitness is increased because the environment is favoring the fact that you are, this whole premise has a name. That's where survival of the fittest comes from. It is the characteristics for the environment that you are in that have the best chances. Are there characteristics that could decrease the fitness of an organism? Yeah, and if it decreases the fitness of an organism, then they're probably not going to survive and reproduce. And if they're not going to reproduce, those characteristics are not going to be passed on. Success of the phenotypes. Remember, the phenotypes are going to be the characteristics we see. The adaptations, which remember, are those characteristics, are going to exist because of interactions. Interactions of those living creatures with both the non-living and the living parts of their environment. Now there's some fancy words for living and non-living. Non-living, we have the word abiotic. And for living, the word we're going to use is biotic. What class are you in right now? Biology. Bio is life. Ology is the study of. So the biotic parts of the environment plus the abiotic, the non-living parts of the environment, are what going to determine if a living thing's going to survive or not. So the non-living or abiotic components are going to be contrasted with the living components, the biotic components. And you have a chart on your note sheets, and this is where you're going to do some recording. First non-living component is going to be climate. Well, when we talk about climate, what are we referring to? We're referring to things like weather, rainfall, seasons, all of those temperature components based on the location on the planet. Availability of water. Water is non-living, and so how much of it clearly is going to be a non-living component. Water being essential for all of our cells to do the jobs that they need to do. Concentration of minerals in the soil. Well, the minerals in the soil directly affect which group of organisms. It's going to affect our plants and even some of our soil bacteria. But as we go into ecology, and most of you know this already as far as the food chain is concerned, if there aren't enough minerals in the soil, excuse me, for the plants to take up, all of those consumers that are going to eat the plants aren't going to be able to survive either. Excuse me. On the biotic side of things, we're going to have competition. We're going to have something called coevolution. And third, we have something called sexual selection. On your note sheets, just list competition, coevolution, and sexual selection. I'd like you to take those three and recopy them in the next table from left to right, because we're going to talk about each of them individually, and that's where you're going to record information. If you don't feel that this is enough space, you do have the whole blank side on the back here that you can continue it onto if you'd like. So we're going to start with competition. Competition from grade school, I hope you know that it's the interaction amongst species for resources. Well, what sort of resources are we talking about? Let me go back up here. Limited resources. Usually we're talking about space. We're talking about nutrients, so our food. We're talking about water. If we're talking about plants, we're concerned with sunlight, right? Could be between individuals of the same species or different species. So it could be those pigeons fighting for food amongst themselves, or ganging up on this squirrely, gophery looking thing. But don't forget about our plants. Our plants compete for space. We've got trees versus the low-lying shrubs, all competing for space. My parents have a place in Indiana, and we've got trees where we've got vines that are climbing up the trees, and they're actually choking the trees. Part of the big problem is that if the trees are dying, we have to replace them. Unfortunately, all these low-lying shrubs are competing for space, and they're not allowing these trees to drop their seeds and have new trees grow. So what's our project for the rest of my life is going in and cutting down all these vines to try to save some of the trees that we have, in addition to clearing out all of these low-rising shrubs. And all of these low-rising shrubs and these vines, as a matter of fact, are called invasive species. They don't even belong there. So I'll be pretty crappy for the rest of my life. Usually competition is more intense when it's among members of the same species, like these crazy bears. They're a little angry, don't they? And they're all fighting over the same fishing grounds. So in your notes, did you write down the words about what competition is and who it can be between and where is it most intense? Did you write down examples of the bears or the plants? Maybe you should, unless you've got the brain that remembers it. Coevolution. This one I really want you to pay attention to because it should be new for most of you. Coevolution is looking at adaptations or characteristics in two species. And those adaptations are usually due to how those two species interact with each other. What do I mean by that? When we look at predator-prey relationships, predators are going to eat the prey. Predation is going to be the noun. But what are we getting at? If I have this picture, who's the predator in this situation? The bear. Who's the prey? The fish. When the bear catches the fish, what can we say about the fish that are caught versus the fish that are not caught? Maybe the fish that are caught are slower. If the slower fish are caught before they're able to reproduce, which fish are reproducing? The faster ones. Well, what about their anatomy allows them to be fast? I don't know, maybe it's their muscle structure. Maybe it's their fin shape. Either way, whatever anatomy allows them to swim faster, those characteristics, those adaptations then get passed on to the next generation. Well, okay, now you have faster fish. What's that going to do to the bears? Well, What happens to the slower bears? They're going to die. What about the quicker ones? They're not. What makes those bears quicker? I don't know. Maybe it's their brains. Maybe it's their muscle structure. Maybe it's their claw shape. Beats me. But again, something about those bears then. They don't eat. They don't reproduce. If they do eat, they are going to reproduce. And so what happens to our populations of fish? They get faster. What happens to our population of bears? They get faster, eventually. Kind of cool. Big fish eats the little fish, right? There's always a bigger fish. This one, we have this beetle eating this caterpillar. Okay, so don't forget about those little insects. Coevolution, like we talked about with the bear and the salmon, can be used the same way with wolves and deer. Ultimately, what happens to our wolf population over time? Or what happens to our deer population over time? The deer who die are slow and careless. They aren't reproducing. The deer who aren't dying are the ones that are probably faster. So as a population, the frequency of our speed allele goes up. Well, as a response, what about our wolves? The wolves who can keep up with the faster deer will still catch them and be able to reproduce. So you see how the two populations' existence are going to affect the P's and the Q's of those other populations. So of these two populations, we've got the slow, careless deer dying out, and then we've got the slow, clumsy wolves dying out. So what are we left with? Faster wolves, faster deer. Is that eventually going to crap out because can they be unlimitedly fast? I don't know. I don't think so. But for right now, that's how it seems to work. Here's another one talking about gardener snakes and newts. This is a very interesting one. I'm not going to give you details about this because there's a video that you're going to watch that talks about this relationship in particular. And it's this relationship and talking about coevolution is what I want you to focus your attentions on. But I want to finish off this part 1 session before I have you go on to the link. So, sexual selection. There's actually a lot of stuff here. So for sexual selection, let's do this. In this little box that you've got here, sexual selection, let's just write, it favors traits that helps an organism acquire a mate. Okay, that's what I want you to write in that box. Favors traits that help an organism acquire a mate. Here are some examples. Bright colors, long feathers, fins, antlers. These are examples of what's called conspicuous features, things that stick out. Things that stick out, like a peacock. A male peacock has this beautiful display of feathers. Why does it have it? It's trying to get the attention of the female. Ooh, look at me. What's the problem? He's too busy strutting around, showing his big old feather fan. Predators are going to notice too. And so then he's going to be picked off. Oops. Does that sound like a good idea anymore? No. Speaking of which, females. You ever notice female animals are kind of boring in color? Why is that? Anybody say camouflage? Camouflage. I'm not sure I spelled that right. Because when they're nesting and taking care of the offspring, being able to blend into their habitat is going to help increase their survival, which is going to increase their offspring's survival. The male is all colorful because he wants to be noticed so that he can contribute his genetic code and be passed on to the next generation. Next type of sexual selection. Goofy courtship behaviors. Males fight for the alpha position. They knock the crap out of each other to try and win the notice of the female. Or they just do weird things with each other. So this is going to favor the males that are more aggressive, that have structures that are going to be more effective in fighting so that they can win that alpha status. And that's supposed to be exciting for the female. All right then. Last thing, loud, complex courting songs. You think of organisms that would do this? Birds for one. Crickets for another. But here's the problem. Kind of like the bright colors and long feathers, you've got sounds that you're making. That's going to attract predators too. So what does that mean? All the males are trying to do is to get noticed so that they can mate with a female, and at least at that point, their genes have been passed on. The longer they can survive, obviously the more often they can mate, and then more of their alleles are going to be in the gene pool. For the guys that don't make the cut, so the structures, the colors, and the displays that do not enhance survival, what they're saying is that maybe the male isn't very healthy and maybe it's not very vigorous. Maybe they just aren't the strongest or the best version of the male that's out there. And so that's that. At this point is the transition to go to the video link. And then with the video link, my expectation is going to be for you to take notes on both the tuberculosis segment and the newt segment, specifically talking about the coevolution of both.